In 1951, a young black mother walked into Johns Hopkins Hospital with severe pain. She had no idea that the next steps taken inside that hospital would change science forever and violate her in ways she would never live to understand. And without her knowledge or consent, doctors took a sample of her cells that would be stored, sold, and spread across the world, becoming the first immortal human cell line in history. This is episode 1 on my series on exploited bodies, the history of medical crimes and injustice against black women. Today we shine light on Henrietta Lacks, the woman behind the immortal HeLa cells, and the decades-long injustice her family fought to correct. Born Loretta Pleasant on August 1, 1920, in Roanoke, Virginia, she was the ninth child of Eliza and John Pleasant. At some point during her childhood, Loretta's name became Henrietta, though no one is certain how or when the change happened. Her family stated her nickname was Henny. Henrietta's life shifted early. When she was just 4 years old, her mother passed away while giving birth to her 10th child. With her father unable to care for all of them, Henrietta and her siblings were split up among relatives. Henrietta was sent to live with her grandfather, Thomas Henry Lacks, in a small black community called Clover, Virginia. Henrietta was known for her hazel eyes, her small waist, and a personality that was both gentle and unshakably strong. Life in Clover was rural and demanding, and like most of her family, Henrietta began working as a tobacco farmer at a young age. In 1935, at just 14 years old, Henrietta gave birth to her first child, Lawrence. 4 years later, in 1939, she welcomed her daughter, Elsie, who was born with developmental disabilities. On April 10, 1941, Henrietta married her first cousin and the father of her children, David Lacks, who also went by the nickname Day. Soon after, the couple moved to Turner Station, Maryland, located just outside of Baltimore, hoping for better opportunities during the wartime industrial boom. There, they expanded their family. David Jr. was born in 1947 and Deborah in 1949. By her early 30s, Henrietta was a mother of 4, while also caring for her daughter Elsie, who was eventually placed in the hospital for the Negro insane. Then, in 1950, something changed. Henrietta began experiencing severe abdominal pain. She told a cousin she felt a knot inside her wound. She noticed bleeding that didn't match her menstrual cycle. The pain only grew worse. She didn't seek medical attention at first, but shortly after discovering the knot, she also learned she was pregnant with her 5th child, Joseph. Months after giving birth, her symptoms intensified. The bleeding became severe, the pain became constant, and the knot never went away. Henrietta was finally referred to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, one of the few medical institutions that treated black patients at the time. What happened during those visits would define her legacy, but not by her choice. In January 1951, Henrietta was examined by gynecologist Dr. Howard Jones. It didn't take long for him to find something deeply concerning: a hard, tumor-like mass on her cervix. Biopsy results confirmed the worst. Henrietta had cervical cancer. She began treatment almost immediately. At the time, standard therapy was a harsh and invasive method of radium radiation, where small tubes of radioactive material was placed directly onto the tumor. The procedure was painful and difficult to endure, and for black women in segregated America, it was often delivered with little regard for comfort or dignity. Before the treatment began, While Henrietta was sedated, doctors performed another procedure she did not consent to. They removed 2 tissue samples from her cervix, one healthy and one cancerous. Henrietta was never told, her family was never asked, and her permission was never sought. Those samples was quietly sent down the hall to the laboratory of Dr. George Gay, a cancer and virus researcher who spent years trying and failing to grow human cells outside the body. In the 1950s, taking samples without consent was common practice, but it was without question unethical. And in the segregated medical system of that era, Black patients received less explanation, less respect, and less protection. Dr. Gay had collected cell samples from patients of all races who came to the Johns Hopkins Hospital. But every sample behaved the same way. They died quickly, they stopped dividing, they broke down, they simply could not survive a laboratory environment. But what Dr. Gay would soon discover was that Henrietta's cells behaved differently. They were unlike any of the others he had ever seen. They divided rapidly, they grew without stopping, and they multiplied endlessly. They seemed immortal. He named the immortal cell line HeLa, using the first 2 letters of Henrietta Lacks, but to conceal her identity, he often claimed the name stood for Helen Lanes or even Helen Lakes, keeping the true woman behind the science hidden. He shared the cells freely with researchers across the country, believing they could accelerate scientific progress. Soon, HeLa cells were being mass-produced and shipped around the world. Henrietta and her family had no idea, but her cells were already changing the future of medicine. Despite treatment, Henrietta's cancer spread with rapid speed. By the summer of 1951, she was in constant, unbearable pain. She was admitted back into Johns Hopkins Hospital, where doctors noted that the tumor had grown so aggressively it was described as almost taking over her abdomen. She lost weight, she struggled to walk, and she grew weaker every day. But even as her body failed her, Henrietta worried more about her children's future than her own suffering. On October 4, 1951, at just 31 years old, Henrietta Lacks passed away in the segregated ward of Johns Hopkins Hospital. But even in her death, the violation of her body continued. During her autopsy, doctors removed additional samples of her cells, again without consent and without informing her family. Henrietta was buried in an unmarked grave in her family cemetery in Clover, Virginia. No headstone, no marker, no indication of the global impact her cells were already beginning to have. While her family grieved, HeLa cells were spreading through laboratories across the world and would become the foundation of modern biomedical research, helping to pave the way for the polio vaccine, chemotherapy and cancer treatments, in vitro fertilization, immunology, genetics, virology, and countless other medical and scientific breakthroughs, while Henrietta remained unknown, uncredited, and unheard of. In the early 1970s, a scientific crisis revealed the truth, at least partially. Researchers later discovered that countless other cell cultures had been contaminated and completely taken over by the aggressively growing HeLa cells. To fix this problem, scientists needed blood samples from Henrietta's relatives, not to inform them, but to help distinguish HeLa cells from others. Researchers contacted Henrietta's children using confusing scientific language. They offered no real explanation. They didn't discuss consent, ethics, or profit. They gave the family no answers, only more requests. This would raise suspicion and questions, but the family was met with silence and misinformation. It wasn't until 1975, more than 20 years after her death, that the Lack family finally learned the truth. Henrietta's cells have been used worldwide for medical research. They also learned that corporations had made billions from HeLa cells, while her family received nothing. The emotional toll was devastating. The family was met with confusion, anger, and betrayal. Their mother had changed the world, and they had never been told. For decades, the Lacks family fought not for fortune or fame, but for respect, truth, and control over Henrietta's legacy. Public awareness finally surged in 2010 after journalist Rebecca Skloot published The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, exposing the ethical violations and the systemic racism embedded in her story. Also in 2010, Dr. Roland Patello at Morehouse School of Medicine donated a headstone for her gravesite. In 2013, after years of negotiations, the National Institute of Health granted the family some control over how HeLa genetic data is used. This was a small but meaningful step towards justice. And in 2023, more than 70 years after Henrietta's death, her family reached a legal settlement with a biotechnology corporation that profited from HeLa cells. The fight had been long, the pain generational, but finally, Henrietta and her family received recognition and some measure of justice. Henrietta Lacks was a young black woman whose body was used without permission, at a time when black patients had little autonomy in the medical system. Despite the injustice she suffered, her cells went on to save countless lives. But the truth is simple. Henrietta and her family deserve better. Henrietta Lacks changed the world, not by choice, but through the exploitation of a system that saw her less than human. Today, her legacy continues to shape conversations about bioethics, racial justice, medical consent, and human dignity. To Mrs. Henrietta Lacks, although your contribution to the world was taken without your consent, we honor you. Thank you for the lives you touched, through the breakthroughs you made possible, and the legacy you never got to see. May you continue to rest in peace. No story should be forgotten, no voice should go unheard. Until the next time, I'm Lock Jewel, and thank you for watching Shades of Crime. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and remember to pray. God's listening.